Lindsey Graham, the cowardly Republican senator from South Carolina, was recently asked to react to the Colorado Supreme Court decision, which ruled that Donald Trump is an insurrectionist who's constitutionally ineligible to hold public office. But in his predictably sycophantic response, Graham weirdly suggested that Democrats are radically anti-democratic by listing radically pro-democratic policies that he says Democrats endorse, and which frankly sound pretty cool, so we should talk about them. But before we unpack all that, if you haven't yet, please hit that like, subscribe, and the alert bell. All right, folks, I've got a couple of clips to play. This one was a bit of a head scratcher. It was pretty incoherent from Lindsey Graham. I'm not exactly sure what he was getting at. And it seems to suggest that his conception of what a democracy is not only radically different from the dictionary definition, but from everybody's definition. So let's watch.
Senator, we're running out of time here. I wanted to ask you about this 14th Amendment ruling by the state Supreme Court in Colorado. Where do you stand on that particular ruling and what can be done?
It's not a rule of law-based ruling. It is a political decision. The hatred of Trump is so widespread. You know, the Democrats want to pack the Supreme Court, abolish the Electoral College, make D.C. and Puerto Rico a state, and nationalize elections through H.R. 1. This Colorado Supreme Court made a political decision. In my view, there is no constitutional basis for the decision they rendered. I think it will be a slam dunk in the Supreme Court. Donald Trump will eventually be on the ballot in Colorado. I think he will win the primary. You've got a lot of good choices in the Republican Party. But this ruling in Colorado is chilling to me, and it would set up a politicization of the presidential races would be bad for the country.
Okay, so that was 60 seconds of some nonsense from Lindsey Graham. I don't even know where to begin. And so I really should start scripting these things, but I don't for various reasons. But like, it's hard to keep track. So he said Democrats want to pack the court, want to abolish the Electoral College, want to make Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico states, and then some sort of national regulation of elections. We're going to address those four things, which quite frankly sound pretty damn awesome and certainly pro-democratic. Let's address some other things. Number one, he said that this would politicize the presidential race. The presidential race is a political race. It's inherently politicized. That makes no sense whatsoever, so let's just disregard that. He also says that there's no constitutional basis for the Colorado Supreme Court's decision. I would argue the Constitution is a pretty good constitutional basis for a court decision. This is Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. Lindsey Graham should brush up on it. It says that if you take an oath to support the Constitution and then you betray that oath by engaging in insurrection or giving aid and comfort to those who do, you're constitutionally ineligible to hold public office, including the most important and powerful office of them all, the presidency. So the basis seems to be there. The scholarship on it is also pretty tight. We're not just talking about, progressives or progressive attorneys or Democrats. We're also talking about conservative constitutional scholars, including people affiliated with the Heritage Foundation, like William Bowd and Michael Stokes-Paulson, who are two conservative constitutional scholars, and they wrote the definitive law review about this situation, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, the sweep and force of Section 3, and how it applies to Donald Trump. So the scholarship is there. It's not even just them, though. We're talking about Michael Luttig, a conservative constitutional scholar and highly respected federal judge, or former federal judge. And then the daddy of them all, Lawrence Tribe, probably the greatest constitutional scholar alive. He's liberal, so Graham probably doesn't believe that he has anything to say of value. But some serious scholarly heavyweights are on the side of the fact that the Section 3 of the 14th Amendment does apply to Donald Trump. So Graham just doesn't know what he's talking about. Now, with that in mind, let's talk about those four claims. Let's start with the Supreme Court. So Lindsey Graham says Democrats want to pack the Supreme Court. Well, actually, I'll say this. The Colorado Supreme Court isn't the Democrats, and it was actually Republican voters and independent voters who brought the case to Colorado's court system. But again, he's just conflating these things. Like, the Colorado Supreme Court, they're basically Democrats. Well, you're talking about a state Supreme Court versus the Democratic Party. I digress. The Supreme Court of the United States has been changed. Its composition, its structure has been changed since the founding of the country. It wasn't set up for just 9 justices at the founding of the country. As a matter of fact, founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, James Madison did change the size and structure and composition of the Supreme Court. It's been changed multiple times. And historically speaking, you've had one Supreme Court justice per circuit, right? And we used to have 9 circuits, which means we ultimately had 9 Supreme Court justices. But we actually have 13 circuits now and only 9 Supreme Court justices. So there's a history to support changing the Constitution. There's the rationale for it as well. And I wrote this on Destiny's subreddit months ago, going into the details, talking about how the court has never been, and never shall be apolitical. It's true. These are people with political opinions occupying these coveted roles. Constitutional principles of checks and balances / shared powers demand that the court be mitigated. The ability of the 2 other branches to check the court is non-existent without engaging in what many consider to be norm-breaking behaviors. And again, I go through all the things. But there is a rational basis to pack the court. And by the way, Lindsey Graham also packed the court when he helped his fellow Republicans steal a Supreme Court vacancy from President Obama in 2016. They said, listen, Obama's an incumbent president in his last year in office, and there's an election this year. We need to hold off. It was a completely unprecedented act. They did it anyway to steal a seat. They gave the seat to President Trump for him to put somebody on the court. And then they broke their own rule in 2020. Then when Trump was the incumbent president and there was a Supreme Court vacancy, rather than enforce their earlier standard, which was, well, we can't fill vacancies during election years. Guess what they did? They filled a vacancy during the election year. And that's why this current iteration of the Supreme Court has a 6-3 conservative supermajority. Republicans pack the damn court whenever they please. They are wildly unprincipled in this respect. So why shouldn't we indulge in the same behavior? Why do we have to pretend that this court is this fixed, immovable, unalterable thing while Republicans can do whatever they want with it? Makes no sense whatsoever. So I think we should pack the court. Absolutely. The first chance we get. Then he says, Democrats want to abolish the Electoral College. Yes, absolutely. Why wouldn't we? Every other advanced democratic republic on earth has ditched this idea. They don't have this idea. Even those democratic republics who have modeled themselves on us, when they look to the United States, like, let's look to the Constitution, let's look to the U.S. structure, let's look to the 3 branches, the separation of powers, the checks and balances. Those are pretty cool. Then when we're like, hey, how about you get an Electoral College? They're like, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Why would we have an indirect election for the most important and powerful office of them all? Why would we do direct elections with everything else except for this one? That makes no sense. And of course, it doesn't make any sense. And the only reason that Lindsey Graham wants to preserve it is because Republicans need the Electoral College in order to win presidential elections, because they won't run presidential candidates who use moderate rhetoric and moderate, reasonable, popular policies or progressive policies. No, but these presidential candidates who are, in the case of Donald Trump, openly fascistic, and in general, just running on wildly unpopular policies. So rather than change and try to, appeal to more people, they just want to appeal to systems and institutions which advantage them. But hell yes, we should get rid of the Electoral College. Absolutely. Then he complains. He says, well, Democrats want to nationally regulate elections. Yes, to some extent. And there's basis for it in the Constitution. Article 1, Section 4, Clause 1. The times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. But the Congress may at any time, by law, make or alter such regulations, except as to the places of choosing senators. And if you look at the jurisprudence and the judicial history of the Supreme Court has held that Article 1, Section 4, Clause 1 provides for Congress, not the courts, to regulate how states exercise their authority over Senate and House elections. We live in a federal republic where, generally speaking, the federal government in many critical ways is the ultimate power. And with respect to regulating elections, that's one of them. We do have the right, and I would argue the moral obligation, to make sure that certain things are federally mandated and regulated. We live in a democratic republic. Why wouldn't we want national federal legislation to make it easier for eligible voting citizens to become eligible voters by registering and then getting out to increase maximal voter turnout? Well, we as Democrats want that because we believe we can be competitive in that respect. But Republicans are afraid of it. And if you don't believe me, just ask Lindsey Graham himself.
If Republicans don't challenge and change the U.S. election system, there'll never be another Republican president elected again. President Trump
Lindsey Graham, and we've talked about this before, is one of many Republicans who openly admit that if you maximize eligible voter turnout, they don't believe they can win elections. And that's why they resist the idea of the federal government stepping in to pass legislation so that states have to maximize eligible voter turnout to get more people to come out and vote. Things like automatic voter registration, stuff like that. Or, mail-in ballots and mail-in voting and absentee voting, early voting days, making, election day a national holiday. They don't want to do stuff like that because that will increase voter turnout, and they think that's terrible for them. They could consider running popular candidates on popular policies, but that doesn't occur to them because they're a minoritarian party. That's why they oppose these things. He also said, making D.C. and Puerto Rico states. Of course we should do that. I thought that, correct me if I'm wrong, folks, but don't conservatives who love and revere the founding fathers and others say that this country was founded on the principle of taxation without representation is bad, right? The idea being that you can't impose your will, you shouldn't be able to impose your will on large swaths of people, and certainly not a country, and not grant them representation. That's exactly what we're doing to a certain extent with Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. There's more people who live in Washington, D.C. than Wyoming. Why does Wyoming get, 2 senators and however many electoral votes, and D.C. gets none of that? How come? Well, the reason that Republicans don't want it is because D.C. swings left. I guarantee you that if Washington, D.C. were a red area, were a Republican-leaning area, they would be clamoring for D.C. statehood. And they'd be right. But it's also right to want it even if D.C. swings liberal, swings blue. The idea, D.C. and Puerto Rico should have meaningful representation in the United States government, where they can not only just be informed, but weigh in, vote, and have representatives who also have voting power as well. That's pro-democratic. That is wildly pro-democratic. And yet, Lindsey Graham says, that's radical. That's insane. Those 60 seconds of Lindsey Graham, that was probably the most wildly incoherent and self-defeating 60 seconds I've heard from a Republican politician like that, outside of, again, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert, Jim Jordan, morons. Lindsey Graham's not an idiot. Lindsey Graham's just a coward. But in those 60 seconds, he said things that were as stupid as anything that left the mouths of Lauren Boebert, Marjorie Taylor Greene, and Jim Jordan, at least in my opinion. Let me know what you think in the comments.